So I return to Aria, and she is going to introduce to you Dr. Ray, and she may have to, no, you just Dr. Ray, and then before you leave, by that time it'll be time to introduce the person who's going to be the interlocutor with Dr. Ray. So go ahead, Aria.
Yes, so for our next session for the Black Bioethics, I'm going to introduce Professor Keisha Ray, who also holds a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Utah and currently serves as a tenured associate professor at the McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics at UT Health Houston. Dr. Ray's extensive body of work is dedicated to examining the impact of institutional racism on the health of Black individuals, amplifying Black voices with the discourse of Black health, and exploring the socio-political implications of biomedical enhancement for marginalized communities. Notably, Dr. Ray is the accomplished author of the book Black Health, The Social, Political, and Cultural Determinants of Black People's Health, published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Ray, you can take it away.
Dr. Ray, before you speak, please add one more little piece. One of the things I should add from Dr. Warren's tenure was a summer internship granted by a relationship between the CDC. And we normally send 3 young people there. And then last year 6, and this year we sent 10 young people into for a paid internship. Now, one of the by this time I've already got my hands on Black Health, your book, and Lachlan Furrow called me talking about, have you read this? And I sit out and let Dr. McDuffie and Dr. Furrow kind of make that happen. But what they recommended is something that is to put your book in the hand of each of our honor students. Now, we have over 100 honor students, so that means a lot, because what Black bioethics means and what it means going forward, there's 2 books that are essential for this conversation right now. One is Optimal Health, and the other is Black Health. These books will become the kind of cornerstone for us to teach our young people to understand what's next up. All right, Dr. Ray.
Well, I don't know how to follow that. I appreciate that so much, both of you. Aria, I'm glad to see you here. And Dr. Hodge, I appreciate the invite. I'm always happy to see students here. Yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate that. I really wrote the book for thinking about the first-year college student, writing it at that accessible level, and hopefully with stories that they find interesting to make it interesting to them. So I really appreciate that. So I'm going to share with you all, let me get all of this. Okay. So I'm going to share with you all how I think about Black bioethics and how I think about the importance of storytelling. And that's really essential to how I do this work in these spaces. So I am a professor at bioethics, but I am housed in an ethics and humanities center within a medical school. So I've always been trying to sort of marry all of these different interests, right? Bioethics, medical humanities, but then also the practicality that medical schools want, that medical students want. And that's sort of how I think about my work, and particularly in the book, Black Health. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today came out of, I think none of us get PhDs or be in these spaces without a little bit of a rebellious spirit, right? And so a lot of what I'm talking about today came out of a little bit of that rebellious spirit, a little bit of that how dare you spirit. I heard a lot of people when COVID-19 first started happening, a lot of people were talking about, where's bioethics? Why hasn't bioethics talked about inequities? And I thought, how uninformed you are and how lost you are. And but it also made me think about, maybe there's a disconnect with the general public, that they don't know that we're doing this work. But how do we find this space where we can say we've been doing this work for decades and decades and decades, but you don't know about it? So how do we bridge those two? So this is how I've been thinking about it. So in general, this is how I think about bioethics. I still think of bioethics as centering the white experience. When I see that a lot, and I review a lot of papers on racism and health outcomes and healthcare. And a lot of times in the quantitative studies, they'll have a lot of participants and they'll be 98% white. And they'll say, this is how people think about X topic. And I'll write the editor and say, we can't publish this. This is not an accurate representation, but it's because it's still centering the white experience. You see a lot of people's individual experiences discredited as not real data, not real information, not really helpful. You see a lot of population focused topics, so topics about certain demographics still being siloed and not mainstream. And you also see a lot of the typical bread and butter topics in bioethics that take up most of the space. And again, these topics, not to say they're not important, but they oftentimes don't acknowledge how they affect marginalized populations. Oops. Wait, let me minimize you all. How do I do? Oh, there we go. So what's missing? So what I think about is missing from bioethics, a lot of what is spoken, who is spoken about, but not spoken with. And I found this really experience when I was writing my cardiovascular disease chapter in my book. And a lot of what makes my book important to me is that I was telling it through other people's stories. Here's the information, here's the data, but here's a real person that lived it. And when I went to write about Black men's experiences with cardiovascular disease, who have the most deadly experiences with the disease, I could not find men telling their story. It was always people telling stories about Black men. And when I went to my colleagues who are in Black male studies, who study Black men's health, they're like, well, they don't exist. That's why you can't find them. And I just thought that was just so crazy to me, that we're telling Black men's stories about their experience of disease, but we aren't giving them the space to tell their own. So you don't see that a lot. You don't see the totality of what it means to be Black in America, and that includes the stories. Missing this histories and legacies as a connection to what's currently happening. And then, of course, social determinants of health. So looking for this comprehensive approach that combines all of this into a way of practicing bioethics that doesn't leave Black people as an afterthought. And that's what I was focusing on. So this is how I think about Black bioethics. So I've written a couple of things on it, preliminary things. Right here at the bottom, if you can't read that, I think about it as the exploration and integration of any event, ideal, technological advancement, person, or institution that directly or indirectly affects the health or well-being of Black individuals or the Black population. So I've done these two preliminary articles on it, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I see it and how it is prevalent in my work. So I think about it as a practice and an ethos, right? It's something that we have to make intentional efforts to do in our work, but also it's about what do we value and how do we see the world. And for me, it's about valuing Black people's individual experiences and group experiences and letting that shine through in the work. But it's also about how we rethink the principles. Now, bioethicists are principled people. We talk a lot about principles, and I wanted the principles to actually mean something, to be real, to not just be something that we teach to undergrads, or we mention justice here and justice there, but to really think about what these principles require of us, and to think about what Dr. Reverie said a little bit about the origins of bioethics and how these principles, what they came out of and why these principles became so central to the way that we practice. So thinking about two in particular, justice and our concern for vulnerable populations, if we are truly principled people who care about these two things, and we can't ignore Black people's inequities or social, political, cultural, and commercial inequities that affect their lives. And to think about it in a way that's not just about those who are specifically working on Black health. And that's really what I think is important, is we can either be acknowledging that all areas in bioethics can either contribute or dismantle anti-Black racism. And so it doesn't have to be, I study Black health, so I must do Black bioethics. You can be studying AI, you can be studying abortion, you can be studying health outcomes. Whatever you're studying, it's probably going to have some effect given Black people's history in America and their association with inequities. So everyone can do Black bioethics. And I think it's important that everyone at least think about it. So to think about what Black bioethics adopt from medical humanities, again, I did some of my postdoctoral work in medical humanities. I've published in medical humanities journals, and I find it to be a different outlet for those things that bioethicists don't, not that they don't care about, but they care just slightly less about. And so for me, I've been trying to, again, marry these two, my bioethics work and my medical humanities. And so for me, perhaps the most important offering that Black bioethics has to give this moment is putting Black people and our lived experiences at the forefront of our scholarship on Black health. I think that too often our experiences are dismissed, they're forgotten, they're deemed epistemologically unsound or epistemologically unimportant, and then making use of things like testimonies, biographies, stories, just other forms of narrative, I think elevates Black people and shows us to be trustworthy narrators of our own story, which is often missing in a lot of settings, in particular clinical settings. So in contrast, this one-dimensional portrayals that other people often give of us, narratives allow people to be accurately portrayed as intersectional, as complex, as fully human, and experiencing all of these joys and pitfalls of life. But more importantly, it's us telling our own story. And that's what I think is central here. And so thinking about what Black bioethics can adopt from Black Lives Matter, again, this idea of storytelling. And one that I always go back to is the story of Trayvon Martin, because that is one where it was very stark that there were two different stories being told. You had one story, like if you Google his name, you'll see these two very stories very upfront and present. You'll have one story told by his parents as this loving son, this loving brother, this funny kid. And then you have other ones where you have the pictures of him holding a joint or a gun or something like that, trying to push this narrative of almost deserving of death, that this was a bad kid. And so what I saw from Black Lives Matter is that we can be all of those things and still deserve to not be harmed. Right. No one is all good. No one is all bad. We're this sort of messy, complex people. But either way, what we have to do is reclaim those stories and not let those stories be told by other people and those stories used to justify our own deaths. So to give you an example of storytelling and how I think about it, I'm going to use the example of Black maternal mortality and thinking about what the narrative should include. So this is the example that I often use to think about, and I'm not going to go over these for the sake of time. I want to make sure that we have a lot of conversation, but just thinking about all the parts of the story, thinking about the history of women, Black women not having bodily autonomy, procreation for slavery economy, caring for white slave owners and their children, even the crack babies, welfare babies that came out of the late 80s, early 90s, experimentation, obstetrical hardiness, sterilization of Black women in prisons. All of these are separate individual stories, but are a part of the overall narrative of why we have inequities in Black women's maternal mortality. Even thinking about misconceptions, right? Whenever I give these talks, someone always brings up one of these about Black women's level of education, not thinking that Black women have some of the highest rates of higher education degrees, not asking for higher salaries, innate biological or genetic differences, a chosen lack of prenatal care, a matter of mortality, right? All of these misguided explanations for why Black women have higher rates of maternal mortality. I think it's good to talk about the misconceptions, because no matter how much and how hard we try to not have them in the story, because people aren't informed, they are still going to be there, but they also help us to get clear of that and to focus on what actually matters and what actually can help solve the problem. So it actually helps us, I think, to focus a little bit on the actual issues, again, like income inequality, lack of funding and investment at all political and social levels, inequities in things like student loan debt and the stressors that go with that, weathering, providers' perception of Black women's intersectional identities in clinical settings. And so for me, again, all of this is a part of the story of Black maternal mortality. It should be about how do we present this topic in a way that doesn't leave out people's stories, but also doesn't leave out the central problems that we are revealed through people's stories. One way that I've also talked about this is to look at those principles that bioethicists just love to talk about, right? The autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just give you one example, and that being autonomy. So using Black bioethics to examine higher rates of maternal mortality among Black women requires us to extend the principle of autonomy to consider the unique institutional barriers facing Black women's expression of autonomy. For example, bioethicists tend to think about autonomy as the freedom to make one's own decisions about what they do with their bodies, and that includes decisions about their health care. Although this is also how we may think of autonomy for Black women giving birth, we also must consider how racism and bias in healthcare can hinder their ability to make autonomous decisions about their care. So, for example, Black women may feel pressure to make a decision that they do not agree with for the sake of not wanting to cause a stir or seem non-compliant by their providers. When Black women are vocal about their care, especially when they disagree with the care that they are receiving, they get labeled as an angry Black woman, a racial and gender stereotype that ultimately ends up silencing them. Fearful that angering the people in charge of their care can mean death for themselves and their unborn child, it's plausible that many Black women engage in Black respectability behaviors like not being too Black in public, and choose to just stay silent. So the lens of Black bioethics, it forces us to grapple with the idea that when Black women are silenced, they cannot make autonomous decisions about their care. So this is an example of how we have to sort of stretch the principles that we already use. I'm not saying get rid of them, but I'm saying that we have to expand how they mean and what they mean to Black people, given our relationship with healthcare and inequities and health outcomes, and more importantly, our relationship with those social determinants of health that have such a great influence on our health outcomes. So again, this is just an example of how Black bioethics ask us to rethink these principles and to reframe how they apply to Black people. So important for me is to tell the whole story, right? So to think about, in general, to continue this conversation about what Black Americans Health says about health equity in the United States. So this is a part of the health equity story. Tells us that we lack a comprehensive approach. Institutions don't work together, that the unique lived experience is ignored. The interconnectedness of our lives is ignored. Again, how all of our lives are affected by these institutions and their connections to each other and their connections to the social determinants of health. And then also centering individuals and communities' voices missing. Again, giving people platforms to tell us their story and let them decide what they need from us. And then what does it say? What does Black Americans Health tell us about bioethicists' work in health equity in the US? And I think one thing too that I didn't put here is that this health equity buzzword, a lot of times people throw it around not knowing really what it means. When I talk about health equity, I'm thinking of health equity in the access to resources needed for proper health. So our health equity work and all of bioethicists' work, I think we have to move differently. We have to rethink these values, rethink how we're applying these values, rethink who matters, expands who counts, grow our research partners rather than just talking to ourselves in these rooms. How do we teach, thinking about how we expand our pedagogy for our students, particularly those that are either going on to be health science professionals or those of us who already teach in health science professional schools. And then level up our empirical work with social connections. Again, not ignoring those social terms of health and how that affects the story of people. So again, why do Black bioethicists need Black bioethics? Why does bioethics need Black bioethics? Excuse me. So to begin, first, like I said, I don't think that we have to get rid of the established methodologies that we use in bioethics, but I do think that we have to reframe how we apply them and reframe who we invite to work on these methodologies with us. Also thinking about no singular frameworks. When we talk about Black health and just from the perspective of housing or law or employment, we lose part of the story. We're only getting this one very narrow part of why Black people have inequitable health in this country. And then also thinking about how do we make sure that we're always situating Black people's marginalized identities within those institutions that shape health, within this power structure of systems that control the resources needed for proper health outcomes. And so ultimately, why bioethics needs Black bioethics is for relevancy. For one, if bioethics wants to stay a relevant academic pursuit. I think it has to expand who it makes relevant, who it believes to be relevant, who it talks about. It can't keep leaving out large groups of people and think that bioethics is going to remain as important as it is now in the next 50 years. But then also, I think we should strive to be more relevant in the everyday person's life and not just in privileged few who have access to these academic spaces. But I think bioethics is sort of losing touch with the public. It's not doing a lot of public outreach, not a lot of public scholarship. And I think Black bioethics is like a little reminder, like, hey, don't forget about us. Don't forget that those principles that you built this profession on matter to us and matter to us in ways that it may not matter to other people. I wrote about this with some colleagues, Dr. Faith Fletcher, Daphne Marchenko, and Jennifer James, Black Bioethics in the Age of Black Lives Matter, and Journal of Medical Humanities. This is also my way of expanding and exploring these ideas in other academic spaces and doing more of this work in the humanities. And lastly, I'll leave with my book. That's my social handle. I'm on all the socials. That's my website and QR code from my book. And I will end it there so we can have time for discussion.
So thank you so much, Dr. Ray. My God. Ms. Aldridge, can you introduce the next speaker? And then we will have conversation after that.
Yes, and the next speaker is Dr. Hodge. Dr. Augustin Hodge, David Augustin Hodge, Sr., who serves as the interim director, lead ethicist, and associate professor at the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee University. He also holds the position of editor for the Center's Journal of Healthcare, Sciences, and the Humanities and directs the Bioethics Honors Program. Dr. Hodge is a visiting faculty in residence at Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, and he sits on the board of directors of Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research. His academic journey includes a doctorate degree from Columbia Theological Seminary and a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Miami.
Oh, take it away.
Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Audrey. Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. Thank you, Dr. Riverby. Thank you, Dr. Earl. Thank you, Dr. Warren. My brother is also on here, Dr. Dixon Christian, and he will be presenting on autism in about 48 hours. Thank you so much. I want to actually do what Dr. Earl did and basically continue the conversation that Dr. Ray has started. Actually, I have one question because she got so excited. She reminded me of somebody I know. Yeah, me. She got so excited that she used some terms. She was trying to fit it all in there. And so, Dr. Ray, can you explain two things, just the definitions, praxis versus ethos, and epistemologically unsound?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about Black bioethics, I want it to be something that we think about, right? I think that's something in the age of production and academia, we don't sit with it a lot. And so I want it to be a sort of reevaluation of values, right? What exactly as bioethicists do we value, and how do we make sure that the work, the practicality of it demonstrates those values? And so I want Black bioethics to be more than just, this is what I'm doing. And I want it to be more than, this is just a value, but it should be something that does both, because I think action is guided by value. Value should be guided action, right? And so that's how I think about that there. And then epistemologically unsound, I think more about not a sincere form of knowledge, right? And I find too many times that people will say, Black people say, I have this experience in healthcare, right? I've written about my own medical racist experiences. I start my book off with one. I've written about it in different venues. And someone will, it never fails, right? Someone always says, how do we know that's not just your experience, right? Or they'll say something will happen and then they'll say, how do you know the doctor was being racist or sexist? How do you know, right? That how do you know question makes me just like, it makes me just go crazy, because what they're saying is that we don't trust your experiences. We don't trust your view of the world, even though they don't have access to this view of the world because they aren't in a Black body or a woman's body or both. And so too many times when I try to put in stories in my work, some editor will say, but where's the data to back up that story? Not seeing the value in the story in itself, right? It gets deemed epistemologically unsound or epistemologically unimportant. And it's a way of saying this is not true knowledge of the world, or we want this knowledge of the world to be verified by some form of data, even though Black people have these unique experiences that are not always supported by the data. Reminded me a little bit of what Dr. Earl said earlier, that not everything has to be verifiable, because not everything can be verifiable. And so what I really try to do is, especially when I'm teaching, is try to do both in certain spaces. Here's this experience. Now here's this data that shows millions of people have had the same experience, and this is what it means, and this is how we can philosophize about it and that kind of thing.
Thank you so much. We're going to ask that question, and I'm going to speak as slowly as I can, moving as fast as I can, because there's so much that Dr. Ray said, and so much that needs to be unpacked for absolute clarity, because I feel like we have a small window to create the kind of expansion we need to create. One of my first duties, after Dr. Warren said, go for it, was to go and visit each of the deans at the school. Among them, deans or chairperson, Dr. Taronda Lee. We didn't get a sit down yet, but we met in the parking lot kind of conversation. Dr. Abdallah, cervical cancer. These are public health people. By the way, Faith Fletcher, who you mentioned, she's ours, so don't even try to take her. She comes from here. She's a Tuskegee.
Oh, I know. She's one of my good friends. I know.
But when you were speaking, Patricia Hills Collins' work popped into my mind when you mentioned epistemologically unsound. I think it's like her last chapter, when the word epistemology, everyone, has to do with the nature of knowledge. What does it mean to say I know something? And that in of itself is a whole field of complexity. However, what Dr. Ray is saying is that I'm justified in saying that I know something because it's based upon my experience, which is the empirical basis for knowing, which is all we have access to. And so to say that what Patricia Hill Collins points out is that there is a tendency to disregard and disrespect Black women way of knowing. And Black women way of knowing can come in ways like novels, as in, for example, B.B. Moore Campbell or Connie Briscoe, or Waiting to Exhale, and stories of that sort. Mama, those kind of stories where their experience is put in a way that we could say, or someone else could say, I get it. We fully understand when we use that language like epistemological unsound, epistemological valuations, and we fully understand that there's a thing called cognitive closure. In other words, I'm kind of closed off from knowing you. And in that close, I can know me such that I can, but I'm closed off in such a way. However, I may not be able to know you. I kind of know what it's like to be a bat, and I kind of know what it's like to be a woman. I kind of know what it's like to be a white woman. I kind of know what it's like to be a LGBTQIA. I can't. However, through levels of empathy, I could understand something, what it's like. In other words, if a mother loses her child in Martin Luther King Boulevard in Miami, in what's called Liberty City, or in Overtown, if she loses her child through gun violence, and another mother up the street in Weston, Florida, loses her child to cancer, which mother is crying the most? Both of them have lost a child. And therefore, there is a way that we need to understand then that that central to our discourse is that we're all humans. But I love the language of we have different narratives and different journeys, and those narratives and those journeys should be respected. I published a chapter a couple years ago in a narrative ethics book by the CDC. Mr. Charles Pollard and Mr. Herman Shaw, two of the men who were in the syphilis study. And to do a narrative ethical publication, the writer has to spend a whole lot of time kind of becoming that person, walking that person's shoes, trying to understand what they smell, what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. And it's only when you put that empathic time in, can you really grasp the nature of the other person. So saying that, so Black bioethics then for me, it's interesting, we're coming from totally different roles. I never met you before other than reading your stuff. And when I read your stuff, I said, wait a minute, I wrote that because it was just so familiar to me. I didn't write it anyway. I'm just saying it's so familiar to me. And I said, wow, because that's what happened when I first came upon Black theology. I felt a kindred spirit. I understood there's no way that I could, as you just said, Dr. Ray, there's no way for me to prove or verify or validate the veracity claimed by Dr. James Cone. But when he said things in Black theology and Black power and Black theology of liberation, this was written in 1968 and 1970. And I said, I know that. I've had that experience. I know what it's like. I know when I'm pulled over because I'm Black, and I know when I'm pulled over because I'm speeding. Okay, I'm not stupid. I know if I'm speeding, I know when I'm speeding, and I know when the police pull up on me and just pull backwards and pull me over. And what do you pull me over for, officer? Now I'm still a tenant too. I'm not gonna mess with you. I have my license registration. The lights are on. I don't want any problems. The officer, what did I do? And how was your family? How are you doing today? So you're out in a dangerous world. And just kind of throw them off guard and have a conversation with human to human. But I know when I'm pulled over because some have even told me that, what are you doing on this side of town? They actually said that. So I'm not stupid. I know what it means to have a doctor seem dismissive of my medical concerns. Right now, but because of who I am in terms of being David Hodge with a job, I may have access to switch doctors. But there are people out there who may not have doctors, a capacity to switch doctors because they have to go to a clinic, so they have to use whatever they have, and that could be a very difficult situation. So Black theology, Black theology is outlined by James Cone, is a protest theology. It predates actually liberation theology of Gustavo Gutierrez and those guys in Latin America, and it predates them by 2 years. But the language is still on the liberation theology. So those people who are oppressed reading Black theology, those people who are marginalized reading Black theology, but LGBTQIA or women, which are now called womanist theology or feminist theology, say, wait a minute, there are themes there. As you said, there are methodologies there. There are things that I could pull and extrapolate from this because it actually makes sense to me. So then after I read that, I thought, it was like when young Black people read Malcolm X for the first time, it was like, let me go kill white people. You know, they're really angry when you read Roots. Like, I'm really upset. And then you have to kind of tone it down a little bit and start measuring, like Dr. Earl said, wait a minute, all white people are not racist. We got to figure this thing out and how to work together. So that's how I felt when I read James Cone. But then after I read J.D. Otis Roberts and his language of reconciliation, I thought that was a little premature written in 1974. I thought it was a little premature. But I kept reading, and there's something in his language about the goal is to be more fully human, to make people and accept people as more fully human beings. And so I see Blackness then, or Black theology, as something that is both discursive and expansive and embracive of those who find themselves, as Howard Thurman said, with their backs against the wall. If you're back against the world, read Black Health, and you'll find some themes there to pull yourself out from under that thing. So if you're poor and live in Appalachia and your teeth are gone for methamphetamine addiction, you can read something in Black Health and understand, because now you're part of that vulnerable population of those who are being marginalized. And so that is how I took the language. Now, there's another part that of Black theology represented not by James Cone, not by J.D. Otis Roberts, and not by, say, my professor at Emory University, Dr. Noel Erskine, but that which is represented by Dr. Earl. And that's when I first met Dr. Earl. He's my pop, by the way. If you don't know, that's pop right there. Before I first met Dr. Earl when I first heard his voice, I said, "What the heck is this? What kind of human speaks like that?" It's like James Earl Jones. But when I first met Dr. Earl and then heard his scholarship and read his works, I saw something, and I was coming into Black theology really at the middle, because I didn't consider the slave narratives or the slave experience. So Blackness for me then is encompassing of not just the here and now, but the part that came before, because locked in our DNA are those traumas that are continually passed down from generation to generation and continue to maintain adverse childhood experiences, continue to maintain hurt, damage, continue to see our escalating number of young men and women in prisons, continue to see it's heartbreaking that I'll be sitting here and talking to you and it just pops up on my phone. It's like the only people who are arrested in Atlanta is some Black guy. Now, it got to be more, because I love Dateline. And I've noticed that 95% of all the people who did some murder on Dateline were white people. So how is it that only Black people are arrested on the news every night? When are the white folk for Dateline and 2020 and 40 hours? When are they being arrested? So I said that there's something that's kind of funny in how they put this thing out there. You know, who they take pictures of in the arrest. So the language that Dr. Earl spoke in terms of Blackness, this third dimension of Blackness, not having to do with reconciliation so much so, and not having to do with protest, but having to do with identifying the pathway. How, as he says, the imagination, right? Like Christ in the imagination, or Jesus in the imagination of Black people. Because in the imagination, these things are passed down from generation to generation to generation. And then comes the womanist scholars like Renita Weems and Sanders and a host of them who I just embrace. And that's when I started to understand. I love something that you just said. You don't have to be a Black person to utilize Black bioethics or Black health. You don't have to be a Black woman to participate in the womanist conversation. You just have to be someone who cared, someone who empathized. And that then becomes key for my construction of Black bioethics, because ethics there for me then. And it has to do with, number one, virtue ethics, because it has to be about, if we're going to maximize trustworthiness amongst those who are looking at us, we have to be people of integrity and we have to be people of character. We have to demonstrate the life that we live. You know, there are opportunities. There are opportunities for us in the 21st century always, because during the marches and for around George Floyd and all of the protests, my son asked me, "Are you going?" I said, "Look, listen, I'm too old for that now. You young people, you all go out there. I'm with you, but my back hurts. I could barely make it a block." So therefore, but these young people, and what was phenomenal is they're in Japan marching. They're over in Netherlands marching. These white folk, they were no Black people. They understood and they grabbed hold of this notion of what Black bioethics mean. So therefore, what does it mean to me? It means that there are some informed consent, extremely important. Belmont Report, extremely important. Principles, extremely important. end of life conversations, abortion. These are extremely important conversations. What also is important is the ignoring or the repeated invisibility of Black life in when we speak about things like I mentioned earlier, an excess death categories. Hold on. If Black lives, I love how Anderson Cooper put it. He went down to Albany during the beginning stages of the pandemic, and he said, what is happening in Albany is criminal. He said, these Black people are dying at a faster rate than anybody else. How the heck does virus know to go for Black folk? It's like tornadoes only going for the what do you call those places? The campers, those mobile home communities in Tulsa, Oklahoma. How does the pandemic know to go for only go for Black people? Well, I didn't know much of what the word morbidity meant until I sat under Dr. Warren. But there's something called morbidities and something called comorbidities. And that you can have trimorbidities. If you are already obese with diabetes and cardiovascular disease, like Dr. Ray points out, right? And you already have these things that's part of your narrative. You're dying already. When a pandemic shows up, and by the way, another one is coming, it's going to be like the 9th ward and the 7th ward of New Orleans. Is they knew sooner or later a Katrina was coming. Sooner or later, it was going to come. But they chose not to fortify the walls. Therefore, you had massive devastation amongst the poor. And same thing is true in public health. Public health and population base is about the least, the lost, and the left out. It's about those people who can't fund for themselves. And if we don't take the time, if bioethics don't put the pressure on public health ethics to make sure you see me as an individual, as a person, if we don't take the time to do that, then we have a massive problem. And if public health doesn't put the pressure on bioethics, and so there's some epidemiological issues that we need to have, such that there must be some dialogical conversation between the bioethicists and the public ethicists. If we don't do those things, then we have a problem. Additional problems. So Black bioethics then means that, yes, focus on those things. But we, that is Black, white, or other, are going to focus on those things that's going to ensure that we have a chance. And if that means going to Uganda, to the University of Global Health Equity, and say, listen, we need to partner, because it's all about partnerships at this point. You can't be nationalistic. This is a time for, this is life and death for many people. If this means going to Berlin and walking to the Holocaust Museum and learning about the experience, and then say, okay, I've done that. Now you come to Tuskegee and you walk with me down to Montgomery, Alabama, and let's go to those museums so we can see that there's no competition of victimhood. However, there is protest that's necessary that we must all put together and do together. So Black bioethics for me then is grounded in virtue ethics, and then it is massaged very nicely with empathic care ethics. By that I mean, on the very basic level of what it means to be human is to care for somebody else. If a baby is not cared for, baby will die. So we got to be concerned about all those babies, whether they're 1,400 babies in Israel that were killed by Hamas, or 4,000 babies in Palestine that were killed by Israelis. We got to be concerned about the baby. Caring for doesn't care about pigmentation, sexual orientation, anything like that. Caring for means that you have the right to be cared for because you are who you are, because we are who we are, and therefore we don't have a choice. Now, in addition to caring for is the notion of caring about. So you could care for somebody and not care about them. So you could be a doctor, very mechanical, and just give the medication that's needed, give the vaccine that's needed, and say, "Now go on your way." So you could care for somebody in a deontological way and just following the rules of the game, but don't care about them. And that's another level. Caring about them is where empathy pushes us to do something greater. Now, those of us who are Christians or following some religion of love, then love can also step in and give us that oomph to say, listen, I'm tired now, but I'm going to do more. I'm going to take another step in the journey. So Black bioethics then is concerned about the least, the lost, and the left out. Is concerned about the 13-year-old girl in Kenya. Is concerned about the 13-year-old girl in Argentina. Is concerned about the 13-year-old boy in Gaza and the 13-year-old girl in Israel. But is also concerned about the little fella living in Ukraine right now, right this moment, who's running from some bomb. And if, like Cornel West said, that we got to be as concerned about the chocolate kids as we're concerned about the vanilla kids. Otherwise, we'll become just like those people who did not take us seriously. That's what, to me, Black bioethics is. And I love, my dear sister, that we seem to be on the same page, because it's about, I'm not talking about Blackness in terms of ontology or Blackness in terms of philosophical stuff. I'm talking about Blackness in terms of I like how President Obama said, when we say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that white people's lives don't matter. It means that there's something particularly unique going on over here, and we need to pay attention. If you have my brother Lachlan Furrow, I never quote this right, but he says, I said, how you doing? He says, I could only be as well as my least happy child. So therefore, whichever one of my children, I have 3 children, whichever one is the least happiest, that one is going to get my attention. That doesn't mean I love that child more. That means that one needs my attention right now. And I think that's what we need to have. That's what Black bioethics is all about. And that means that as I close this part of my section, that means that that our narrative must include the nearly 1,000 missing tribal women who have gone missing. They're people of color. They're gone missing, and we don't see Natalie Holloway. And no disrespect to Miss Holloway, no disrespect to Natalie Holloway. When you lost a child, that's a terrible thing. But here it is 30 years later, and the conversation is still on the table, right? We're still salaciously connected to that. And no mention of those tribal women who keep going missing. That just boggles the mind. And to Dr. Earl, there is, I hear what you're saying, but there is a messianic portion to this chair. There is a part of this chair, sitting in this chair, because if you lack empathy, you have no business serving in public service. You cannot do public health ethics. You cannot do neuroethics. You cannot do clinical ethics. You cannot do research ethics. You cannot do bioethics if you do not have the empathic heart to do so. So that means it's very, very, very hard, because now we're humans, so we have to pick and choose which fight we're going to fight. I understand that fully, but at the same time, the question is, who is the mother losing the child today? And that's where we have to put our fight. So that's Black bioethics for me. And now Aria had to go to class, so now I become the person. So now I would, there are questions in the queue, and so I would read the questions, and then Dr. Ray, you could answer first, or if you want to pitch it back to me, then I would answer second. Dr. Lachlan Forrest says, Dr. Ray, thanks for your great work. Question for both you and Dr. Hodge. Imagine the future. Would love to see 10 years from now. The future you would love to see 10 years from now. How a conversation on Black bioethics, womanist bioethics, indigenous bioethics, disability bioethics, and others relating to and enriching each other. So what would that conversation be like in 10 years?
So I think a lot of these groups developed out of necessity for not being properly situated within bioethics. And so I think it's cool that people have our own interests. Right? We're always going to have our own specific interests within bioethics. Bioethics is a huge umbrella term. But I also am now starting to see, which I hope continues into the future and becomes even more intertwined, but seeing more collaboration between these groups, right? So I do some work with the Latinx bioethics group, some with the disability bioethics people, and you start to see that like affinity groups, ASBH. But I think it's okay for people to have their siloed interests. It's just a matter of And we ignore how we get so siloed that we forget that some of the topics and things that we research affect other people in different kinds of ways. And that's what I hope we take into the future of bioethics as we start to develop groups based on shared interests. But I do hope that there's more collaboration, and maybe one day there won't be the need for all these different groups, that it will just be bioethics, right? Bioethics we won't have to talk about focusing on disability issues, because disability issues will be central to bioethics. We want to talk about having an Indigenous ethics group that talks about the social terms of health for Indigenous people and these missing women, because that again will be a part of just what bioethics is and what it does. But I think until then, these groups arose because it's just not how it is. So I do hope the future that changes.
Lovely. Thank you. What would it look like in 10 years? Well, I don't think it's gonna be Star Trek yet. that Star Trek is still fiction. Where everyone on the Starship Enterprise is from someplace else, and they had the mutual respect of each person because of their capacity. Because if you had asked the question 10 years ago, where would it be 10 years hence, and we would have probably said something euphoria. But we're seeing in real time the disregard for human life. I mean, who would have thought that we'd be witnessing what we're seeing now at this point? I remember in 1980. I was in high school when even before President Reagan, but with President Carter, when they were trying to broker deal for the Middle East conflict, and the fellow by the name of it begins with a B, and then there's Anwar Sadat. Remember him from Egypt, and I didn't understand it much then, and here it is. What is this? 40 years later. And we're still having this conversation. And if you put it in their own space, then you're talking about 6,000 years later, or 4,000 years. They're still having this kind of conflict. So then the question that Dr. Forward asks is respect to like, where do we see our conversations going? Well, I would answer, for example, what would I see the conversation of Black theology going? Is it still, do we need to get rid of Black theology? Should we get rid of it in the next 10 years, because we would all be singing Kumbaya and having a wonderful time? We have people who have deep disconnections with others, deep disconnections, and that deep disconnect is extremely dangerous, because they lack empathy. The conversation that we're having today, even in terms of who's the president, who's going to be the next president, or looking at just to get a speaker for House. Did we ever think we'd be this far into the Democratic hole, like trying to find like which way is up? It's a horrible mess. In 10 years from now, I pray that I could flutter my wings as fast as I can to this right now, that I would affect the 13-year-old child in Kenya 10 years from today, and that 13-year-old child would have vaccines. That all the vaccines, from polio to malaria to all the vaccines. It shouldn't be the case. And interesting, Lachlan asked the question, but I think it's very powerful. And I see Dorothy Woody, I'm going to let you ask the question. I see you have your hand raised. But Lachlan asked the question, showed me something, I didn't even realize it. But during the height of the vaccine being spread about, he pulled up a map, and 67% of the United States vaccinated, 68% in Canada vaccinated, 69% in England, Europe, Africa, 2%. What the hell is going on? 2%? And now the greater part of Africa that was being vaccinated was, guess where? South Africa. And then who were they receiving? Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson, which were probably the three best? No. What were they getting? AstraZeneca, the one that people were terrified about, right? So 10 years from now, the question is, how much humanity are we all willing to invest? You know who I'd like to answer that question? Dr. Warren, he just retired from 51 years of service in public health. 51 years. So he had four fingers. He had 5 opportunities to answer that question. So the question is, Dr. Warren, are we any further along? And now, listen, I am hopeful. I'm not optimistic. 2 different things. That to be not optimistic doesn't mean I'm pessimistic, right? I am hopeful, but I'm not optimistic that there will be a kumbaya. So Dr. Warren, so let's put that question to you. In 10 years, how do you see this thing played out?
First and foremost, we are much further along, because what we've done is reveal the mistakes and we don't have to repeat them. So what I'm encouraged by is, as we expand our conversation, then we bring on new generations of new thought. And so I think this opportunity, even for Dr. Ray and for you to be in conversation, is really exciting, because out of that, you were on the same page in many ways, but didn't know it. So now that you come together, you're much further along. So I'm encouraged. And on the note of retirement, retirement has no real meaning. I just change it where I do what I do. So how do you retire from a commitment to improve Black life? You don't. So that's why I'm here, and I'm excited about where you are and what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I want to ask Dorothy, because I'm supposed to push this button over here. Dorothy Mapson, you have a question? You could go ahead and raise it now. Dorothy Woody. Wait a minute, I got to ask her actually to unmute. Well, she may have stepped away, so while we're waiting for her, Dr. Christian, this is your field in terms of the medical world, and Dr. Christian is also a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Air Force. So he has traversed literally. See, I've traversed Dade and Broward County. Well, he has literally traversed the world, and so he's seen things that we have not seen. As a matter of fact, he's a flight doc. And so therefore he had to be on the plane and back in Iraq and Afghanistan and bringing those detainees or whatever you call them back. So Dr. Christian, what do you have to say to that question that Dr. Furrow asked? In 10 years from now, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I hope that education used to be that thing that moves the needle forward. However, we have this thing called misinformation that has pervaded our whole social media platforms, and this is purposeful misdirection. To what end, I am uncertain, but I know this, that if that continues to happen, it'll spread a lot of misconceptions about things, and folks now don't get news from a reputable source. They just get them from wherever they get them, whether it be Fox News or conservative radio or even MSNBC, et cetera, et cetera. I think the spread of misinformation is causing more doubt and more reluctance for people to engage in purposeful vaccination. And so anyone will tell you that vaccines are by far the most effective intervention that man has ever come up with. I think the opposite is true, where disinformation is one of the more deadly forms of forces out there that creates doubt within the minds of individuals all across the world on a scale that we've never seen before, and therefore that can drive the needle and the whole equation backwards, if you will. I am hoping that something else wins out. The scholars had more power because they wrote more books. Now the social influencers have more power because they have more likes. And so that drives the needle in another direction, and hopefully something else would come along that drives the needle forward in a progressive way. And when I use the word progressive, not that, you know, we all sit down and sing Kumbaya, but we become more educated about the things that will make best outcomes for our individual lives.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I have a question from Alex Crosby. He says, Dr. Ray, you mentioned about making bioethics relevant. What do you recommend about how bioethicists can collaborate with public health practitioners, clinicians, community members, etc., to develop, promote, and implement practical interventions to improve health? This could be in the area of maternal health or other conditions. Beautiful question. Dr.
Yeah,
Ray?
no, this is a great question. And I think this is one of those that sometimes we make it more difficult than it has to be, because a lot of people want to be heard. A lot of people want to collaborate, especially in these areas where they traditionally have been ignored. And so I feel like, I know it's going to sound super simple, but just talking to people actually does a lot. But I think a lot of academics, we get so in our little corners of the world, in our offices and working away. But there's so many people who hold community events, go there, participate. There's so many local organizations that have websites that have events that you can go to and attend. And I think it's about how you move in those spaces, though. That's not a takeover mentality. It's not a I know better mentality. It's not a let me show you how to do things mentality, but it's really a collaborative. And especially if it's community, it's let them tell you what they need. Because I think a lot of times too, academics, we think that we know the problem, and we may know one side of a problem and do it great and do a very, very good job with that. But even within Black academics, we still have privileges that some community members don't. So we still have to acknowledge and listen and participate, but at the same time, sit back and listen, and sometimes, you know, shut up and just observe as well. But even locally, like thinking about, like, I'm in Texas, and I have 3 major universities that are all separated by one street. Baylor College of Medicine, UT Medical School, and Rice University are literally just lined up. But yet I had to email someone and found out that they're working on some similar research that I am, and they're literally next door. This is what I mean by first reaching out to people and seeing just who's in your neck of the woods. You can start local. Texas, even Houston is a huge city with so many universities, and then going a little bit broader in Texas. But it was just this lesson in talking to people more, getting involved. And then they put me in touch with someone that has a local organization about making sure that there's that they teach young Black kids how to grow food and that kind of thing, right? So then I start doing that. So even just acknowledging those connections that can be made by just sending an email or reaching out, having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. But I think we have to just push ourselves to get outside of our offices, outside of our little area, and expand. So I think sometimes we make it a little bit more complicated than it really has to be, but I really do think it's as simple as talking to people, and then finding out where your talents can best be used, and what people need from you and what you can give them.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Thank you so much. We have, and that's the point I was making, that I find it fascinating that Dr. Abdallah, Dr. Lee, Dean Perry, Dr. Webb, oh my goodness, that we have so many of the same interests. And when I realize that we have these similar interests, and therefore it's incumbent upon us to kind of push and be a part of what is being done. So this is PHEI, but there's also, as a matter of fact, yesterday when PHI started, yesterday at the same time, there's one that I'm from the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, and there was a public health forum going on in St. Thomas. And so I couldn't get on there, but as soon as I can, I'm going to get on to that, because I think that we have mutual interests, and we should be able to have the conversation about those interests. Thank you so much. So we have a question here from Dr. Furrow. Doctors Ray and Hodge, people in bioethics, seeing defining issues through the eyes of professionals, talk a lot about the problems we have because Black patients do not trust physicians. Dr. Wangai Mugai has taught me seeing, defining the exact same things through the eyes of patients that we need to talk at least as much about the opposite direction problem. Physicians who do not trust Black women to know almost anything about their own bodies. Question: how can Black bioethics help the field of bioethics understand that every issue can only be understood through the eyes of all the people involved?
Oh, okay, I'll go first.
Sure.
I want to make sure that I'm understanding this question because my first instinct is to say, well, yes, sure, right. If you want to understand any problem, you have to understand as many sides of the problem as you possibly can. However, there is such stark power imbalances within this scenario that I care a little bit less about why physicians of any color don't trust people when they have the power to do better, right? So I feel like there has to be a little bit of a balance here, that I want to understand where biases come from, why they think that Black women aren't trustworthy narrators of their own body, but at the same time, I feel like that's still just giving more power to the problem than it really deserves, and that I want there to be more action rather than let's understand why people are racist, why people are sexist. I think we're a little bit past that point of the understanding why someone thinks someone is not human or why someone doesn't have the same human characteristics as someone else. But again, I'm not positive that's what you mean, but I do think that Black bioethics in this attention to narrative, again, my view of Black bioethics, in this attention to narrative, it is important to have all parts of the story. And if there is a particular reason, maybe it's because of what clinicians have seen, maybe it's something that they were trained, right, as a medical student educator, I think about their training and how that influences things like racial inequities and health outcomes. So yes, that is all a part of the story, but I'm not always going to be trying to understand the oppressor, right? Like I want the oppressed to be understood. But again, part of the story, yes, but at some point, I think we have to move a little bit beyond that.
Thank you so much. We have about 5 more minutes, and we have a very important question. And yes, the name is Menachem Begin. That's correct, Dr. Crosby. So let me take a stab at how can Black bioethics help the field of bioethics understand that every issue can only be understood through the eyes of all the people involved. And I always felt there was a problem back in the beginning of 1968, and the kind of hippie movement, and coming out with feminism and gay and lesbian rights and these kind of things. It was like that was a moment in time. But I always thought it was interesting, the language of inviting somebody to the table. How the heck you get to on the table? How is it your table? Why is it your table? I even think that the language of postmodernism, which is a wonderful language of taking down barriers, embracing some levels of relativism that maybe perhaps doesn't go too far, but give people both subjectivity and objectivity to understand problems and move forward. I do think those are very powerful concepts, but I do have a problem when you start to talk about, for example, the gangster rapper, right, at the table. Postmodernism says there is a breaking down of walls, breaking down of barriers, but I'm interested in a kind of polycentric world in which I am my own center, and I need to understand me, and then you need to appreciate my understanding of me. It's not my job to try to figure out your many implicit biases that may have come down from your great grandfather who likes to fly a Confederate flag. So I don't have the energy, the time, the focus, the drive, the determination to sit down and try to figure out somebody else's thing. I think it'll be easier for me to go on to another doctor who may have my best interest at heart, because this could be very, very cumbersome. One of the things that we need to start doing more of, and I talked about care ethics earlier, but there's a word actually that precedes care ethics, and it's called relational care ethics, as Neil Noddings describes it. and that there's a part of care ethics, not just the caring part, but to be in relationship with others on this journey that Dr. Ray talked about. We're journeying, we're on a pathway. But as I journey, I have my own narrative that I'm constructing. I have my own biases. I have my own prejudices. I have this thing that I'm fighting with. But it should not be the point of victim competition where I'm minimizing somebody else's struggle. Whether or not I agree with LGBTQIA, to me, that's really irrelevant. That's not my issue. I have one question: regardless of how you define yourself, are you human and do you feel pain? And if you feel pain, then I have a responsibility to minimize your pain and maximize your pleasure or healthy pleasure such that I'm able to do so. So in that way, we open up the conversation for others. We have, when you think about this, the awesome responsibility of right outside about 50 yards up the street, there are 63 young women in the Bioethics Honors Dorm. And then about 400 yards up the street, there's the male Bioethics Honors Dorm. And across the campus, across the campus, and they have within them so much positive and powerful good, but they also have so much baggage and pain, and we have a responsibility not to fortify their pain, but teach them, back to your word, by giving them a new epistemology, a new set of knowledge, because each time you have a new epistemology or a new cosmology, a new worldview, it gives you new options that you may not have even considered. So, and so relationships is important, but the other part of it is we have a lot to figure out, but they're going to be very helpful in figuring it out too, because they're actually going through the experiences. They're going to figure it out. Let me ask the last question. Dorothy Babson, are you there yet? Dorothy Babson, can you hear me? Okay, so we have we have two questions actually, and it'll be Dr. Lockton Ford will be the last question. But one of our, this is what I mentioned earlier, Bianca Alcina, she is applying to Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics. She is going. She is a descendant family member for the syphilis study, and she is on Bioethics Honors Program. So the next level is to get a master's degree in bioethics. She's also in the bioethics minor. So Dr. Ray, perhaps too, if you could kind of have a off conversation, because she's following the path a lot of what you are following. So that'd be very beautiful. Her question is: good afternoon. As a 20-year-old bioethicist, I often find myself having to explain the concept and importance of bioethics to my peers. What are some methods that can be useful for making the field of bioethics and public health more appealing to youth? I had a little snap answer, but Dr. Ray,
I say, can I take this really quick? Because I do have to leave in like a minute. So I am very encouraged. So about 3 times a year, I speak to high school students that are very interested in bioethics, and they're taking bioethics classes in their high school. So that just shows me that they are already interested. And I think that's kind of what Black Bioethics is saying, is that we have to talk about issues that affect people now and that will make them interested. We have to talk about their lives. And I think that's one way to do it, is to answer your question, is to talk about how Black bioethics, or bioethics, in general, is a part of their life. So thinking about their health, their access to education, thinking about books in the classroom, even thinking about things that may be affecting younger people, right? Thinking about children, right? So many different topics that you go through every day are the subject of bioethics. It doesn't have to be just clinical or health outcomes, right? And so I think that's one way to do it, is to show that all parts of life can be studied. I remember when I was doing philosophy, and someone was studying philosophy of video games, and I was like, you can do philosophy of anything. You can do bioethics of anything that you can think of. There is a bioethics angle, and I think you have to show that part, that there is no part of a 23-year-old's life that bioethics can't have can shed some light or can use bioethics to understand that part of your life. But at the same time, I get very encouraged by young people who are studying it as it is and finding ways to make it relevant for themselves. Like I said, these 16-year-olds are reading my book, reading my work, and then they have some of the best questions that I've ever answered. And I do a lot of talks, and they come in with the hard-hitting questions, and I'm like stuttering. I'm like, I gotta think about that. So it already tells me that they are very, very interested and are very just into what bioethics has to say. But thank you, absolutely. Always feel free to email me if you want to have a quick Zoom or chat or have a question in the future.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ray. We have actually come to the end of our journey. And so we want to thank you so much for being with us today. We want to thank Dr. Riggins Earl, my pop, for being a part of this, Dr. Susan Weatherby, Dr. Ruben Warren for being a part of this. I want to thank Dr. Dixon Christian for joining us. He's for 2 days early, and this is great for all of those who can come on early to participate and to share with us. So thank you so much. So assalamu alaikum, peace, shalom, blessings upon you.